back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
We always need to hear both sides of the story. We need to hear both sides of the
Both sides of the story, whenever possible. It's The Law Show, and we aim to do our best here on CIL 650. I'm Sterling Fox. In studio with me, Joe Murphy and Alex Sayn-Wittgenstein from Murphy Battista LLP in Vancouver. We're talking about wrongful death, and just to get a handle on this, we talked about this still current law in British Columbia which places no value on human life in terms of claims for death for people who are seen to be or not seen to be of economic benefit to our society. Bizarre law. But let me go, Alex, help me out with this. I want to go back a while. I want to go back to the O.J. Simpson case just to understand the whole concept of wrongful death. We saw that Bronco driving through Los Angeles, and he had a gun, and it was a circus. And that wasn't half of it. The circus was at trial. Lance Ito, the judge, O.J. defended by the Dream Team and all. It really was a circus. At the end of the circus, O.J. was pronounced innocent. He was cleared of the charge of murder. So,
okay, Sterling, I want to jump in there.
Okay.
He wasn't found innocent. The court didn't find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay.
Didn't mean he didn't probably do it. But it meant there was a reasonable doubt, and my reading of the coverage of that case is the jury concluded it couldn't believe the police.
Right.
And the evidence essentially all came from the police, and that's how I think the jury said we can't convict him because we just don't believe the police.
Right, and you're quite right to stop me up on that, but I think from a layman's perspective,
Yes.
if you're not guilty, you're innocent.
Yes.
And that's the conclusion that I leap to, but you're quite right. So the family of the man that he murdered takes him to civil court and charges him with wrongful death, where he's convicted, Alex. And so how did that happen? How do you get to be acquitted in criminal court and yet found guilty in civil court of basically the same charge?
Yeah. The criminal finding of innocence won't be binding on the family in the civil proceedings. Joe talked a bit about it in that the court in the criminal trial couldn't find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay.
In a civil case, so personal injury case, wrongful death case, it's a different standard of proof. The plaintiff, in that case, the family
right.
of his wife, has to prove that it's more likely than not that O.J. Simpson caused the death. And so different standard. The criminal matter isn't binding on them. They managed to meet that onus. And in that case, there was judgment in the millions of dollars.
Right. So there's no prison possible because it's a civil case. Is that also part of the deal?
Yeah. There's not a finding of guilt. There's a finding of liability, and they put a dollar value on how much he owes in terms of damages.
Do we have similar practices in British Columbia, Joe, in terms of families who, where someone is acquitted for whatever reason of a criminal activity, where then in civil court there is a different finding?
Yes. The criminal court operates on the basis of beyond a reasonable doubt. So if you want to say percentages, it has to be 98% chance that he did it.
Right, okay.
Civil court's 50.1%. The other thing is, in a criminal court, if some things were done wrong by the prosecutor, if a blood sample was taken or a breast sample was taken, but it wasn't done properly, if
right.
a person wasn't warned of their rights, key evidence sometimes gets excluded from the trial,
True.
and that results in a person not being found guilty. But again, in the civil standard of care is that 50.1%. So it's a different measure, and you can be found not guilty in a criminal court, but found in a civil court to have likely done something. In the O.J. Simpson case, is he likely caused the death of the estranged wife and that other poor fellow who was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right. Let me shoot another example in your general direction, fellas, slightly more recent. Okay, very recent. Those of us in Vancouver know the scenario well. This happened on a bridge in Seattle a month or two ago. One of those tourist duck boats apparently had a broken axle, flew across a couple of lanes of traffic, plowed into a bus full of foreign students, and 4 of them were killed. Is it safe to assume, Alex, that out of that horrible traffic accident in which loss of life occurred, that there would be 1 or more wrongful death suits?
Undoubtedly. I don't know the specifics of the law in Washington state, but I have zero doubt that it's much more liberal than it is here in British Columbia.
Okay.
Even if this was brought in British Columbia, there would likely be some Family Compensation Act wrongful death cases that would be brought with the limits that we've talked about. Joe was just mentioning, however, how the courts will sometimes recognize in certain situations that it's possible that a child, especially of certain ethnic backgrounds, there may be an obligation on the part of that child to, in later life, provide some sort of financial support to the family.
Okay, now in the case of this bus accident, Joe, the kids were, they've just been in Washington State for a few days. There were foreign students from South Korea there to take a language program. They're going to be they were just getting a tour of the city, just getting to know you. And in this car accident that occurred, 4 of them were killed. So would the parents of those children or those students who were killed, they would sue the bus company for wrongful death? That would be
the bus company and the duck boat company and from what I understand, it was the duck boat that went out of control.
That's true. Apparently there was an axle broken or something.
Tour bus.
Right, exactly.
But using BC law, if you could show that these children would have likely grown up and in later years have supported the parents, then there's a claim under our law for that loss of support. But the claim is quite modest. If the loss of support is years and years down the road, the amount that's awarded today is even smaller.
So the assumption would be that these young students would return after graduation to their home country of South Korea, develop a career, and, as is the custom, help care for their parents in their old age.
Yes, I know that the Japanese custom is that the oldest son is obliged to care for the parents when they need it. And I knew a fellow, Japanese, very westernized, but he moved back to Japan because his parents needed him to be there to help them.
Interesting.
So it's a very strong cultural expectation, and if that's the case, then under BC law there's damages, but again, the measure of the damages is small.
Yeah, those cases rarely make it to trial because the amounts would be so small. Because let's say it's someone who's 15 years old, the parents in the immediate future would still be spending money to send them to university.
Absolutely, yeah.
So using our economist model of calculating damages, they'd have to deduct that from whatever would then be perhaps given to them 30, 40 years down the road. And that amount, because it's would only be obtained 30 to 40 years down the road, has to go through all sorts of economic models to be heavily discounted because the person's getting the money now instead of having to wait 40 years to get it. So it ends up being
much less.
Much less.
Ah, okay. What happens in a case where there's a wrongful death, where someone is killed as a result, say, of an accident similar to that duck boat accident, except in the case of the example I'm trying to bring forward, a person is killed as a result of an accident, but there was also the person who was, say, driving the bus was also killed. And in this case, fault has been determined to be that of the driver of the bus. But that person was also killed in the accident. Can the family of the student killed in the accident sue the bus driver or the company, even though the bus driver was also killed? In other words, can you sue a dead person?
You can. And I'm talking about if this happened in BC. I'm sure it's the same in Washington State. But there's 2 things the family would likely do. Number one, they'd sue the company.
Right.
because the company is liable for any wrongdoing by its employees.
Right.
Number two, you'd sue the estate of the driver. And the estate itself is then liable for the negligence of let's say the wrongdoer driver who has died. Mm-hmm. You might think, well, the estate may not have anything worth pursuing.
Well, that's true.
But there usually is something worth pursuing, and that's the insurance policy. The insurance policy of a dead person will still apply to that and provide coverage for the estate of the wrongdoer.
Okay.
So if the person, when they were driving, had $2 million in coverage and that person was at fault for the accident and dies, a person injured by him in that accident can sue the estate, and that estate should have that $2 million in coverage available to pay out for that injury.
And Joe, what happens if the damages to the person hurt by the now deceased bus driver exceed the $2 million for which the person carried coverage? Are you just out of luck, or is there another avenue to top it up?
Unless there's more insurance, or unless these people you're suing have assets. Now, a bus company is going to have assets.
True.
The driver who's deceased may have assets, but it is difficult to recover assets, because if people know that you're going after their assets, that the insurance isn't enough, chances are by the time you get a judgment, those assets have sort of disappeared. So it's far easier and far more practical to be recovering from an insurance company that has the money set aside to pay the claim, as opposed to chasing someone for their assets.
Alex, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation when just talking about the concept of wrongful death, you applied it immediately to a medical malpractice context rather than I went to the OJ trial and the duck boat thing down in Seattle a few weeks ago. Is it more likely to occur in a medical malpractice scenario than it is out on the streets and the highways?
No, I still think it's more likely to happen in a motor vehicle accident than in a malpractice situation. There's dozens of accidents every day in BC, many of them quite serious. BC has its fair share of malpractice cases, but the deaths caused by negligence in a malpractice setting are still considerably lower than those that arise in an accident.
Curiosity question for you, Joe Murphy, before we take the break. Going back to that tragic story of the grandfather and his 3 grandchildren who were killed in that van accident in Ontario by someone who, according to news reports, flunked the breath test rather badly.
Yes.
So, in this case, if he's proven to be over the limit, would that negate his insurance coverage? And if so, where would the money come from that the family of these now deceased children who are looking for compensation?
Sterling, it's common in the private insurance industry to have a breach, such as drinking and driving,
Right.
void the policy.
Right.
But one of the great features about ICBC, and this is part of the great job they do in providing insurance coverage for everyone, is the ICBC policy is that if there is a breach, the victims aren't victimized further. So if someone's got $2 million of insurance and they're drunk as a skunk, that is a breach.
Right.
But ICBC still pays out the victims. They then turn around and say to the driver, you owe us $2 million. And may or may not ever recover anything. But that's good news, because it doesn't victimize the victims. It looks at the person who was responsible for the breach.
Now, if you're in another jurisdiction like Ontario, where if his insurance, the breach of terms and conditions by driving drunk would cancel his insurance, are those people looking for compensation in a wrongful death trial? Are they just fresh out of luck because he's got no insurance anymore? He blew it.
Yeah, like BC, Ontario has coverages. When you buy your own insurance coverage, you can buy coverage that extends to another driver if he injures you or your family and doesn't have enough or any insurance.
Oh, like
we have it underinsured motorist protection, the UMP.
That's right.
They have that in Ontario too. So and And it's invaluable in BC to have the excess pay the other $24 a year,
right,
and get it because it protects you and your family.
So in terms of take-home lessons already from the program, we're already back to square one with ICBC, and the $24 a year that every British Columbian can be charged for this it's excess underinsured motorist protection. Have I got it right?
Yes.
And $24, $2 a month will cover any and all contingencies in a wrongful death scenario.
For you and your family.
Up to $2 million.
Amazing. For $2 a month. Think
Great
about
deal.
it next time you get the new sticker for your license plate tag. We'll take a quick break. It's The Law Show on CIL 650. Lots more still ahead. Stay with us.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.